Again, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name is Hillary Stevens, and I'm with Restore America's Estuaries. Our speakers today are Tom O'Shea and Russ Hopping with the Trustees of Reservations, and they'll be telling us about a project in the Great Marsh in Massachusetts. Today's event will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel on probably by the end of the week or early next week. So if you're interested, please check back and feel free to share that with anyone. Restore America's Estuaries is a national nonprofit dedicated to the protection and restoration of bays and estuaries as essential resources for our nation. As you can see on this map here, we are a member organization with organizations around the country, including the Gulf Coast, the East and the West Coasts. We serve as an advocate and a convener for these member organizations, as well as coastal professionals nationwide. We are a DC presence and an advocate there, and our headquarters is located in Arlington, Virginia, just outside of Washington, DC. I have a couple of updates for everyone today. First of all, I'd like to announce the recent release of a new website called the Coastal Restoration Toolkit. This is a great resource for lots of information for homeowners and anyone really interested in looking at how to set up a restoration project. It includes very user-friendly information about everything from permitting to where to go for local information and project examples. So I highly encourage you to check it out. There are links to it from our website, estuaries.org, and the URL is right there on your screen. In addition, our National Estuarine and Coastal Virtual Summit, unfortunately, due to travel restrictions, we have had to go virtual. It is scheduled to be September 29th through October 1st, and registration is now open. Again, if you go to our website, estuaries.org, there is a link there for how to register and more information. Without further ado, I'll move on to our topic today of the Great Marsh Resiliency Project. Our speakers today, and you see their images here on the right, are Tom O'Shea and Russ Hopping. As Director of Coast and Natural Resources for the Trustees, Tom O'Shea leads the Trustees' Coastal Strategy and Initiative and oversees the Trustees' Natural Resource and Ecology programs. Tom has over 20 years of accomplishments in natural resource conservation and stewardship and holds a Master's of Public Administration from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and a Master's of Forestry from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Russ Hopping is the lead coastal ecologist for the Trustees of Reservations. He has a master's degree in environmental biology from Antioch, New England Graduate School, and a bachelor's degree in human ecology from the College of the Atlantic. He's worked for the Trustees since 1991 after completing his undergraduate research on human disturbance to migrating birds at Crane Beach. Russ has been instrumental in documenting baseline natural resources, completing property management plans and policies, and directing the management and restoration of significant habitats. So we'd like to welcome them both. And as a quick reminder, as our next event in August, we'll be hearing from the National Wildlife Federation about an oyster restoration project in Maryland. So stay tuned for more information about that. And if you have any topics or speakers you'd really like to hear from, we are always looking for new topics. So please feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. My email's there on your screen. Always welcome to talk about it. And with that, let me hand things over to Tom.
Great, thank you so much, Hillary. And we, Russ and I, really appreciate the opportunity to present our work and the Great Marsh and to talk more about what we think is an innovative approach to marsh resiliency. I'm going to share my screen and then we can begin. Can everyone, or I should say, Hillary, can you see my screen?
Yes, you're good to go. So take it from there.
Awesome, excellent. Great. Oh, and now it's gone. So just give me a second.
I think we've still got you, actually.
Oh, you still got it. Okay, great. All right, so we're going to go through a project that's been building over the last 3 years for us. And it's a project that we realize is something that we think is urgent and we need to start today. And we've begun over the last 3 years to build this project from what had been a very small pilot study to something much larger. And so we're going to go through what that is. And Russ is going to give you a great background on sort of the historical perspectives of marshes and how they've been managed and altered over time, and a new technique that we're starting to use, and even other techniques we're considering, but he gives a great historical and ecological background. I'm going to start off, though, with a little bit of a context for the trustees and our work on the coast. And you'll just give me a second. These PowerPoints do take some time to advance sometimes virtually. So the trustees have about 30 coastal properties across the coast, and we own and protect 120 miles of coastline. It makes us the second largest landowner of coast in the state. And up here in the North Shore is the Great Marsh region, and we have several properties in there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our partners in that area. But one of the things that we noticed over the last 5 years were unprecedented changes in erosion and shoreline change and flooding instances, both in terms of public access and the marshes. And so we're seeing a lot of storm impacts that we hadn't seen before. And we know that these are dynamic places on the coastline, but we had really noticed this to be outside the normal range that people historically had seen. And one of the things we thought we would do is to really start to anticipate the future was to do a coastal vulnerability assessment. Or in this case, what we've also called a climate vulnerability assessment with Woods Hole Group out of Woods Hole in Falmouth, Massachusetts. And they helped us really look at just inundation probabilities of storm and sea level rise combined through a probabilistic hydrodynamic model, looking at where our places would likely flood in 2030 and 2070. You can see this is a barrier beach system. And you can see the different colors for the likelihood of flooding in the year 2030. And then we looked at some of the hotspots of impact from some of our coastal resources that were of high consequence to us. And then we also looked at the sea level affecting marsh model, which is to say that we wanted to see how wetlands would change over time, coastal wetlands. This is a property of ours at Old Town Hill in Newbury. And you see this high marsh, this irregularly flooded marsh, right, in light green, and it starts to convert in dramatic change over to regularly flooded marsh, more tidal flats, conversion to open water. And it's seen even more pronounced than this than in the Old Town Hill area, which could be one of the more resilient places in the Great Marsh. But we knew that there was going to be a dramatic shift after 2050. When we looked at all of our properties, we saw that we had these sort of top 5, and in the North Shore, Crane Beach and the Great Marsh were in the top 5 properties at risk for major sea level rise and storm surge impacts, as well as our island properties in the Vineyard in Nantucket over here. So these became sort of the focus of a coastal strategy, and Hillary mentioned that we are now looking at a coastal strategy across our properties. And one of the things that we're focusing in our strategy is how do we save the Great Marsh? And when I say save it, it means how can we save high marsh? Because if you look at this high marsh area, it's one of the largest in New England, maybe one of the best chances for resilient marshes on the East Coast. It's an important migratory bird pathway and habitat. It's also critically important for fisheries as well in this area. And we own about 15% of that marsh in green. When we talk to some of the scientists that have been working in the Great Marsh, like Ann Giblin or David Burdick in University of New Hampshire, and also Woods Hole Group, we compared sea level rise rates with marsh accretion rates currently right now observed. And for those marshes that are at, like, say, about 4 foot in elevation, they're kind of at that threshold where and of course, some of the marshes are at higher elevations, up to 10 feet in elevation. But if you look at those that are on the threshold, they basically are not on a good trajectory here. And sea level rise eventually outpaces them and completely submerging, as we saw in the SLAMM model in some cases, out here past 2070. So if we can do something to help really lift that accretion rate of these marshes, then they might have a chance to keep pace with sea level rise, preserve options for the high marsh into the future. And that's one of the things we're thinking about with this project, is how to really help increase marsh accretion and stop those marshes from sinking. We are working not by ourselves, but with others, such as the Essex County Greenbelt Association, which owns marshland, State Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a wildlife refuge, and we're looking at projects in terms of a NACA grant that would expand upon our 300-acre pilot project that Russ is going to talk about and bring this to an even larger scale, potentially of over 1,000 acres. We're also thinking about marsh migration, and in this case, these are areas that we expect will convert to potentially high marsh, but given topography, they have an ability to migrate. But much of the Great Marsh, there isn't that ability, and there's real coastal squeeze because of topography and tidal barriers that it's not going to go anywhere. And so that's why we want to make sure that we were not just thinking about migration, but also restoration within the marsh. This just gives you a sense from the SLAMM modeling, the acres that currently are not protected as permanent open space and that are expected marsh migration. And then you look in 2070 in total, you're somewhere between 500 and maybe up to 1,000 acres of what is a 16,000 acre marsh area. So those are a finite set of areas that potentially could be parcels that we protect. So that's part of our thinking in our marsh strategy. And we've identified some parcels. We're starting now to do that and talking to landowners and telling them about what is likely to change. Much of this is agricultural, low elevation, very gradual topography, and looking to see if there are ways that we can begin to really protect the future salt marsh. So with that kind of gives an overview and a context. And I think at this point, just to kind of let everybody ask some questions. I could take one or two, Hillary, now, or we could just go right into Russ's portion of the presentation.
I think we can move right ahead. If folks are interested in submitting questions, you'll see on the right side of your screen, there are question boxes. Feel free to enter anything you've got there. I'll be reading them aloud to the presenters, but at this point, why don't we go ahead, Russ?
Great. Well, thank you, Hillary. Sorry, Tom?
Should I play the video or should we move past that?
If you want to play the video, that's a great overview.
You can certainly try.
Yeah, assuming technology works here. We can certainly skip it if it does become, oh, that's positive.
Let me know if you can hear this, Russ, too.
I can hear it. It is a little choppy, but. Depending upon what people can hear, what you're seeing is it's a drone flying over the marsh that I'm going to be talking about in the adjacent areas. So I will be explaining some of what you're seeing here. Yeah, Tom, I think the audio cut out. I'm explaining a little bit about marsh subsidence here and a little bit of the history of why that's happening. Again, I will be covering this in a minute. You're seeing the marsh there back in, I think that was March, maybe early April. So this year's growth hadn't started yet, so it looks very brown, but it does allow you to see the amount of water that is staying on the marsh surface. Looks like it froze on my end, Tom. Not sure if you're muted. So Tom, I'm assuming you're seeing what I'm seeing and it's gone back to the beginning of the presentation. So I'm not sure if you guys can hear me or not. If Hillary or Tom could let me know, that would be helpful.
Yes, Russ, we've got you. Go right ahead.
Ah, thank you. Okay, great. All right, so sorry about that, but that's technology can still be a little bit challenging with this. So I'm going to cover everything that we were talking about in that short video. But anyway, so Tom already covered this with the SLAMM modeling, but what I really want to highlight here is just to set the stage that even though Old Town Hill Reservation, which is what you're looking at here, that's all outlined, is at the middle of this 16,000 acre Great Marsh ecosystem. And as Tom said, up to 2030, it remains mostly a high marsh. It's roughly 80% high marsh. The rest is low marsh and some open water. And you see by 2070, virtually everything, at least in this scale here, has converted over to low marsh. Now, I'm not sure where everybody that's attending comes from, but at this location in Massachusetts, we have a fairly sizable tidal range. It is at the southern end of the Gulf of Maine. So really from about mean high tide, that 4-foot elevation and up is where we experience the high marsh. And that is, it's a plant community that's dominated particularly by Spartina patens, which is that classic salt marsh hay species. And then the lower marsh is dominated by the Spartina alterniflora, which prefers to be flooded twice a day. Next slide. I think we have a lag. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability to advance them on my end. Hillary, I'm not sure if you're seeing it advance. I am not.
No, I'm trying to work with Tom on this. Stand by, please.
Gotcha. So while they're working on that, I'll just mention, so again, the high marsh there is dominated by Spartina patens. Really only wants to get flooded about twice a lunar cycle. So it's at the very high end of the tidal cycle. And then we also end up with a juncus, a rush, the saltmarsh rush, and saltmarsh grass, disticulus. Those three really form this high marsh plant community and even integrate into this salt marsh upland edge where it becomes quite brackish. All right, we're back on track here. So what you're looking at is the project area again. So this is in Newbury, and this is a road that was built a long time ago that bisects the salt marsh. The reservation part that we're working on, this 85 acres, is on the right side, and the left side is a combination of some other land conservation land, a little bit of the trustees, and some private land, and then it attaches to a very large state wildlife management area. This is all right behind it's not really a restriction, but it's well inland of the primary marsh platform. So we get a lot of mixing here of some freshwater, but this is a classic scene now. I mean, this was a rare scene not that long ago, but as a result of sea level rise, we are now beginning to see almost on a weekly basis. This is a scene that you might encounter. In fact, during the higher tides, the water just does flow right over this entire road. So indication that change is certainly happening. Okay, next slide. Here we go, excellent. So what's the problem? I mean, Tom mentioned it a little bit. So in addition to sea level rise, what we've learned is a good portion of the Great Marsh, and I don't think it's unique to the Great Marsh, but it certainly is something we're seeing wide scale throughout the Great Marsh here, is subsidence. And this is a little bit of a tutorial here. Some of you may be familiar with this, others may not, but we are looking down on a site within the 85 acres that we're working on. Combination of upland edge, salt pans, and you see some straight lines. The darker straight lines are the old ditches that were created initially by the farmers when they settled this area in the late, mid to late 1600s. So this goes back quite a ways. And then those light areas, almost white, those are the highest areas of high marsh. And again, this was done in, I think, April, so the marsh hasn't greened up yet. So you're seeing last year's growth. But those white areas represent old embankments. And then the very darkest areas are the pools. You may think those are natural pans. In this case, they are not. And you're beginning to see them form fairly straight edges in a lot of cases. So they're generally following some of the old embankments. And over time, what's happening here, these are continuing to expand to become one giant pool, which we're calling mega pools. You'll see those brownish areas in kind of in the center of the picture, and then some over in the lower left. Those are areas of the marsh that have become so inundated, so saturated, that the Spartina patens has essentially died. Those are dead patches. The next move for them is to go and transition into this open water. And then the coarser look that's there throughout most of the photograph there is transitional marsh. It used to be high marsh dominated by patens. It is now a short form alterniflora. And during the low tide, typically there is a residual layer of water staying at the surface. So this entire marsh system you're looking at there is on the brink of completely converting over to one big mega pool. Okay, next slide. I'm going to explain a little bit why that's happening here with some of the additional images. So the technique that we're looking to implement here, and actually have started to implement, is called ditch remediation. And this was a technique that was pioneered on the adjacent Parker River National Wildlife Refuge with not only U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff, but Dave Burdick and his staff at UNH. And really what it involves is building the marsh back up in selected ditches that were created again by for agricultural purposes, using the natural materials right on site. So this is hand mowing using a walk behind mower, several swaths up to 20 feet to cut that salt marsh grass, and then it gets moved into the bottom of the ditch. And that's what's being represented here by this cross section. So on these deep ditches, would only do a third of the ditch at a time. And what it's doing is it's allowing the sediment that's trapped on the incoming tides to kind of strain out, drop out, infiltrate between the salt marsh hay that's secured in the bottom of the ditch. Essentially, we're trying to recreate as close as we can the natural peat building process of the salt marsh. And eventually, over 2 to 3 years, again, depending upon how many treatments are needed, each of these ditches that we target will essentially grow from the bottom up and no longer function as a ditch. And that's important because in many cases, these salt marshes were over-ditched, so to speak, and that was intentional to dry out the marsh so they could improve agricultural productivity. So next slide. And while that's happening, I just want to say, so when the hay is moved over into the ditch and a new process has been developed that kind of does it all in one motion with some walk behind machinery, it's secured with some twine and oak stakes, all biodegradable, but it secures it so on the incoming tides, it does not wash away. So while I'm talking about this, Tom, if you could advance to the next one. So this is the 85 acres in Newbury at our Old Town Hill Reservation. And if you look at all of this is essentially the restoration plan, and the next image that you're going to see is a little higher quality. But everything in the blue and the green represent the ditches that were initially created by the farmers, and all of the red are the embankments that were created. So you can see there's virtually none of this marsh that did not have a serious alteration of its hydrology. All right, so while they're working on that, so kind of the first generation here, when the Europeans arrived in this area, this was familiar landscape for them. They came from areas in the coastal areas in southern England where this was a familiar habitat, and they knew they had been managing salt marshes for agricultural productivity for a long time. So this was familiar territory. So the 85 acres is the first site that we're going to be working on. And as I mentioned, that work has started. It started back in May. And then this is one of the 2 other areas we're expanding to for 330 acres. We really felt to demonstrate the efficacy of this ditch remediation as a landscape level restoration tool to restore marsh hydrology, we needed additional sites. So we chose 2 other sites. This is one of them. It's right behind our Crane Beach barrier. And that's the main access road onto the beach. But this is 132 acres here. And you can see the same pattern, lots of ditches, lots of embankments. And again, the red are embankments. So, and then the blue areas would be areas where we would have to unclog some of the ditches. Our goal here is to restore more of a natural hydrology that's based on primary channel hydrology. And I'll get to that a little bit more. So next picture. And we chose these sites because they did have easy access, so to speak. We didn't choose 100 acres out in the middle of the marsh where we'd have to get in boats to go access it. So these all have reasonably decent access. So this is the 3rd site. You can see some real crazy ditching going on there. These were sophisticated operations. Whole companies were formed to do this kind of work. They were hired and they would tackle hundreds of acres at a time and create very sophisticated drainage systems. In this example, you can see there's some orange dots. In addition to ditch remediation, which I just want to pause on this. So I think I didn't cover this, but we're not filling in all the ditches. So we're only filling in about 50%. That's a very rough number. So that 50% is important because when the farmers arrived, they pretty much doubled the capacity of drainage by putting in these ditches. So we're trying to restore that natural hydrology by healing, if you will, 50% of those ditches. And as I was mentioning, those orange dots, those are our Saltmarsh Sparrow nesting islands. So we're introducing the concept at that site of runneling. This can mean a lot of different things, but in this case, we are proposing to use runneling, and this is where we're opening up a new channel, so to speak. But it's really not new. It's in where we've identified we want to put these. It's in old natural creek channels that were no longer used as a result of the ditching. And the material that would come from these runnels would be used to create small islands about 10 feet in diameter, slightly above the highest tide, so that we would give Saltmarsh sparrows the option of nesting in some of these sites. They will very quickly revegetate back into high marsh. So broad scale of things here, scope, I should say, is just over 300 acres, 3 different sites. Ditch remediation being the primary tool. We introduced this concept of runneling at 2 of the sites on a very small scale. Roughly $800,000, lots of partners, very interested in this, what we would call low impact, nature-based solutions that could be ramped up at a landscape scale to eventually treat, something like 8 to 10,000 acres in a Great Marsh environment. Next picture. Yeah, so the goals here are pretty much as you see them there, but we're on a subsidence trajectory right now, both in terms of an oxidation trajectory as well as a saturation or waterlogging trajectory. So our first step is to stop that subsidence. It's a perfect storm, so to speak. We don't want the marsh to be subsiding when sea level rise is rising. So we also then want to reestablish that high marsh. So where we've already experienced, or the marsh has experienced a subsidence where it's no longer being dominated by that high marsh habitat grass, patens primarily, we want to turn the system back so that the marsh is accreting. It can do that when the hydrology is right. We can see 3 to 4 millimeters a year in the high marsh scenario, more under the low marsh scenario. That's important because a species such as the Saltmarsh Sparrow, which has become one of our kind of flagship indicators, so to speak, range-wide data through the SHARP program indicating it's 9% decline annually, less up in the Great Marsh. This is a species that we think is a decent indicator for high quality marsh. And if it is going to survive the next few decades of sea level rise and marsh subsidence, then we have to take some intervention steps now and scale those up in the coming decade or two if this species is going to survive. And then, we really want to see that natural process kick in. We want to tweak it so that nature will do the rest of the work for us and then keep pace with sea level rise. Next picture. So what I'm going to get into now, after I talk about the Saltmarsh Sparrow, is actually, the actual kind of history of how we got where we are. But Saltmarsh Sparrow, so as I mentioned, it's an obligate species, pretty much for high marsh habitat. This patens dominated. It has a it's evolved with the tidal cycles for high marsh, breeds from southern Maine down to Virginia. The southern range, it's declining much faster than it appears to be in the north part. Roughly 10% of the global population occurs in Massachusetts, and half of that occurs in the Great Marsh. So it's a pretty significant landscape could be very critical for this species. Yeah, that was fine. You can go ahead. The projections are not too good for this species. So here's kind of the history of how we got where we are. And virtually, I just want to say, every acre of salt marsh almost has, at least for Massachusetts, certainly for the Great Marsh, has gone through this trajectory, this history. So early 1600s, Europeans arrived. This was a familiar landscape. It was readily available, forage to some extent, but more important for bedding, things like that, for their livestock. But this is what they would have found: a marsh in balance with creeks. So these creeks formed naturally, and they were in balance with the area of marsh. Next picture. So what they then did is they set about immediately fracturing that entire natural formation of creeks and put in these ditches, just in very close together, from upland down to the creek edges. And this was done to facilitate the draining of the marshes so that they could increase the yield of salt marsh hay. Next picture. They got a little more sophisticated over time. They were able to put in embankments. So either using the material that was excavated from the ditches, or they would bring in material. These are essentially berms that they created to literally stop the highest of tides from flooding these areas. So in a combination with the ditching and the embankments, they were virtually able to control when and how an area got flooded, if it flooded at all. Next picture. This is what they ended up with. This is a picture from Ipswich in the general area of one of those pictures I showed earlier. Essentially, as far as the eye can see, it's very reminiscent of prairie, flat as can be. And these are staddles, wooden staddles that were created. Farmers would then pile up the cut hay on top of these and they would typically wait for a flood tide and then come in with gondola type style boats and float out that hay. Very manipulated. Those you can see, not a lot of variety and diversity out there, but certainly not a lot of water. Next picture. This is essentially just recapping at our first site, the 85 acres at Old Town Hill, essentially what happened, and using our air photography and what we can dig up and what we can literally ground truth for. All of these ditches you see here in green and blue would have been what the farmers had created. And there's literally 219 of them. What we're planning to do here, by the way, is what you see in green, we will remediate. Everything in blue will remain open as the primary channels. The marsh does need to flood and drain, so we can't eliminate all of that infrastructure. Next picture. And there's all the embankments. Very difficult to see these. If you're standing there on that road or in that marsh, it's not easy to see those, but they are still there and they are still influencing the hydrology. Some of them are only a few centimeters above the surrounding salt marsh plain, but that is enough to influence the hydrology. Next picture. You can see it was pretty involved, and this is a picture from the 1820s American Farmer Journal. It's literally showing how to do this, how to isolate salt marsh from the tidal influence by creating these embankments. This even shows a simple tide gate diagram. These were all made out of wood at that time. And we've actually come across some of these, remnants of these in the salt marsh that we're working on. So we know this was widely practiced. And then the upper reaches of these embanked areas, so to speak, were literally converted over to growing either fresh hay or root crops. They could do this because there's a lot of freshwater runoff into the system. That's typically where we're seeing Phragmites colonize. But these would have been areas that they would have completely converted over to higher production agriculture. In some cases, they were able to increase the yield of the salt marsh from 1 ton an acre to 3 tons an acre. So it was worth their energy to go about doing this. But the point being here, virtually every acre has been highly manipulated, and the infrastructure is still there to some extent. It's still functioning, and it's influencing how this marsh is behaving, and particularly how it's able to cope with sea level rise. Next picture. So a primary reason why this practice stopped was the internal combustion engine. It's not the only reason, but it was around that, the 1900s, start of that century, when salt marsh hay became less valuable, and it just was not worth the energy and the effort anymore to maintain that entire system. So farmers would just walk away from it entirely, just walk away, leave all that infrastructure, was not maintained. And as a result, the ditches started to fill in. They would slump, the blockages would be created, those tide gates fell into disrepair, and water ended up staying on the marsh. That very quickly became known as Saltmarsh mosquito breeding habitat. These areas were looked on very poorly and said, hey, it's nothing but a swamp, a marsh, we need to drain these. So efforts were put into place to reopen many of those ditches that the farmers had put in. And then this transitioned into the Depression and the WPA, where people were put to work to literally, in many cases by hand, reopen all of these ditches. But that was short-lived. You can advance, Tom. So that was short-lived. And by the end of World War II, the late 40s, this was typically, the marsh ditches were being maintained by a single person out on one of these tractors. And even then, it was not the whole marsh. It was very selective. And then, at least in Massachusetts, by the 70s, 80s, all ditch maintenance was stopped, even those that were pretty much targeted by mosquito control districts. So we're now in that same pattern again. About another 50 years or so have gone by, and we're now in this scenario where the infrastructure is still falling apart. The marsh is becoming saturated. So next slide. So what you're going to see here is a picture from a Rhode Island marsh, but this could be the Great Marsh. My guess is it could be anywhere in New England. And these folks are standing in recently flooded marsh. So this, not long ago, this was high marsh. This was Paytense dominated. And you can see behind them, there is a band of taller grass. That's an old embankment. That's what they look like now. And that's pretty much the only high marsh out there. So if I'm a Saltmarsh Sparrow, for example, that's about the only habitat I'm going to find. And where these folks are standing, that's recently died saltmarsh grass, so Paytense, Spartina Paytense, that has died. And that's from saturation. Even though it likes to get flooded occasionally by the tides, they do not do well. The species does not do well when it remains saturated. And when the marsh cannot drain, this is what happens. And then the root mass completely dissolves. The whole system where this grass is dying because of the flooding, it just collapses. It can 8 to 12 inches over a period of just a couple of years. That's a big drop. And this is what happens. You end up with these, dead salt marsh grass, very shallow water, and then these pools continually expand. Next picture. So this is what you're seeing is a mega pool. So back to Old Town Hill in Newbury. This is what the vegetation looks like on that 85 acres. This was part of the design. We mapped this for the design, I should say. You can see the mega pools forming. They're outlined in blue. You can see in many cases they are these wonderful straight edges to them. These are not natural pans. The next darker color that's outlined in green, that's transition marsh. This is low form alternative flora. And if you walk there even at low tide, chances are you would be soggy, and the marsh, which used to be very firm, is falling apart and you're sinking in a couple of inches. Yellow is outlining stands of Phragmite. And then the yellow, that greenish yellow out by the creek, that zigzag line, that's the only high marsh that's out there. So that is still dominated by Spartina Paytense. If I'm a Saltmarsh Sparrow again, it's about the only possibility of finding habitat to nest in. Even though it looks good, it may not be. It still may getting flooded more frequently than the sparrows can nest within. Those, essentially, they need a 28-day period without those mega floods. It's not long in the future that this Spartina Paytense areas are going to convert over. Next picture. So our system here is we're trying to essentially intercede here and stop this trajectory of marsh subsidence by selecting these auxiliary ditches to fill with the salt marsh hay. And you see that in action here. So this is the contractor walking behind a mower, a few passes, and then that hay is, the cut hay is raked into the bottom of the ditch and secured. And what we're doing is we're essentially using tide sheds. So all of that red, those embankments that you saw, we're treating as individual tide sheds, essentially small watersheds, and then designing what ditches need to be remediated so that we restore that primary channel hydrology to each of those embanked areas. And what that does is, by filling in these ditches, if you will, the water that would normally flow through those is now redirected to the remaining ditches. And those will not fill in as a result of the increased flow. The other advantage to this is any sediment that is coming in on those incoming tides will not settle out and will be pushed up onto the marsh surface where we need it to allow the marsh to grow. Next picture. This is just an example of how the hay is secured. You can just make out some of that light twine. And this is, the twine is treated with vegetable oil just to give it about a year's length of life, to, again, to keep that hay from floating away. Next picture. And this is pictures from the nearby pilot project that was done on the Parker River National Wildlife Refuge. And what it's showing is just simply 2 years of treatment doing this ditch remediation. And you can see about 18 centimeters of ditch building was done on an annual basis. So this can happen fairly quickly. And then once these ditches get to about where they're exposed to about 6 hours of sunlight and they're not being inundated for too long of a period of time, then the Spartina alterniflora colonizes very rapidly, and that allows for that marsh building process to get accelerated. We won't need to treat those ditches anymore with this cut hay technique. And these particular creeks then, ditches, will then finish that accretion process and meet up with the marsh plain. Next picture. That may have been it. Yeah, so that's essentially the end of the presentation. I mentioned that, you know, in addition to the ditch remediation, we are trying to advance this concept of runneling in addition to the ditch remediation, where we're still going to end up with some pockets of marsh that are on the waterlogged trajectory. We just can't tweak the hydrology enough with the ditch remediation. We are looking at putting in these runnels. These will be very shallow, so something about 4 to 6 inches deep by 2 feet wide, so that they do not fill in, and they will revegetate very, very quickly. And then the material from that is used to create that micro topography. We're building a citizen science program where we're looking at the impact of this work on breeding marsh mosquitoes and bird use over time, not only breeding birds, but general bird use. So with that, that's the 300 acres and plus that we're trying to use as our pilot project, but the goal with our partners, that does include the state, other land conservation organizations, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is to think about scaling this up and looking at remediation of 1,000 acres plus at a time. And I think that was the last slide. Perhaps I think we have some time for questions. Just need to recognize our funders.
Thank you so much, Russ. I'm going to go ahead and bring back to my screen because Tom is having some technical challenges there, and hopefully lifting that will make it a little easier for him. So thank you again, and we do have a couple of questions. We've got just a few minutes here for questions. Let me read those out to you. First of all, somebody asked if it would be possible for you to put the link out to that video so that folks can go back and watch that on their own time. Is that on your website, or where can folks find the link to that?
It is on our website right now. You can also, one, it's on our YouTube channel, but it's also on our coastal microsite. So if you just Googled the Trustees on the Coast, you would get to that microsite, and we have various videos there, including that one.
Great, thank you.
We'd be happy to share a link though with you.
Great, okay. Why don't you guys get me that link and I'll see if I can circulate it to the attendees. Next question, is there any short-term benefit to fish or invertebrates in the mega pools that you see as marshes are subsiding? Are the conditions in these pools anoxic, or can you talk to any wildlife benefits that they might provide?
Yeah, from what we can tell, they function slightly differently than the natural pans would do. These are, as you saw in that picture, these are incredibly shallow, typically, only a couple inches deep. They're not supporting fish populations like we're seeing in some of the natural pans that we have out there. We would not be treating these natural pans. But they do serve, well, sure, we see birds use them quite a bit. That's one reason why we are using, well, through the citizen science effort, we are trying to document bird use at all 3 of these sites on a weekly basis, 365 days a year. But in terms of breeding birds, we're not seeing any use. So rails, Saltmarsh sparrows, again, which is our target, we're not seeing them use these areas other than maybe the highest of the embankments that may divide these. We're also not seeing mosquito use in these areas so much. So that's one thing we want to document. We believe that the mosquito production will actually go down in these areas, but we want to document that. And along the way, if we do see any increase, what, if anything, we need to be doing about it. If there may be a short blip on these in terms of an increase in mosquito production, but that should just be very temporary. Other than that, we're not seeing any aquatic vegetation that would be natural. We're seeing a lot of algae production in these pools. That's another thing that's happening is as the salt marsh grasses die off and that biomass is released, together with the sun, we're just seeing massive algae bloom. And what ends up happening is they dry, as those pools do dry out, the wind is blowing them, or wave action when they don't dry out, into these huge blankets of algae that just smother the adjacent marsh. So that's another kind of consequence of these mega pools.
Interesting. Okay. One more question. You're working in a mainly rural or suburban setting. Have you encountered and how have you resolved conflicts with land use, infrastructure, roads, housing, other things?
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. Thankfully, our marshes are in more of a rural setting. I mean, I hate to use the word pristine because we know that's not the case now. But one thing we're doing is we're not recommending this treatment for any area that's experiencing tidal restrictions. So marsh that is behind some infrastructure that is causing a tidal restriction. So far, we're only proposing it where there's very minor restrictions and/or those restrictions have been removed. In most cases, there's no conflict at all with the infrastructure or nearby, housing, buildings, things like that. It either doesn't exist or it's at an elevation that's not going to be impacted by our work. If anything, they will benefit from this work.
Okay, that is about all we have time for. I want to thank you both very much for your time. This is a fascinating project. And again, I will try and get the link out to the video that you guys showed. And again, the organization is the Trustees of Reservations based in Massachusetts, and you can find more information about this project and others there. So thank you guys again, and to all of our attendees. Stay tuned for information about our next webinar from the National Wildlife Federation coming up in August. All right, everyone, have a good afternoon. Thanks again. This is Hillary Stevens from Restore America's Estuaries.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.